I'm Joe Devine, welcome to Whiteboard Football Extra. Today, I'm joined by Seb Stafford-Bloor to talk about what Daniel Levy has described as unsustainable spending in the Premier League, and also the effect of a, to this point, lacklustre transfer window for Tottenham specifically. Before we get started though, I'd like to ask if regular listeners could be so kind as to review and rate this podcast on iTunes. It really does help us reach more people, so if you can spare the time to do that, that'd be amazing. We won't hear from Danny and Matt this week, but they are still out in the Netherlands. New videos of their journey will be up on the channel on Saturdays, so do check in for those. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. Seb, I want to ask you about Daniel Levy's statement last week, or a couple of weeks ago actually, regarding Tottenham's transfer policy. This summer we've seen the top clubs in the Premier League spend a lot of money, with projections suggesting that the league is set to break the window record of 1.1 billion this year, as it seems to do every year nowadays. In the middle of all of this, Tottenham haven't signed any players, despite selling on Kyle Walker for 45 million. Levy's financial explanation for this was twofold. Firstly, that the club are privately financing the building of their new stadium, which is going to cost around £750 million. And secondly, he described the league's spending generally as unsustainable. So that I think find that quite interesting. Added to that, obviously, Pochettino has a lot of faith in the academy, and the club would reportedly rather give their youth opportunities than spend on bringing players in, unless they're going to, make a visible difference. So I wanted to get your thoughts on all of that, regarding both the idea that spending is unsustainable more generally, and more specifically to Tottenham, the effect that a lack of business this summer might have on the team.
Yeah, I mean, they are two very separate issues. I mean, with regards to sustainability, I think, Joe, if we look back on the last 20 or 30 years of football, there has always been a sort of quiet voice in the back of all of our minds saying that, this can't go on for much longer. And I think you could probably trace that back even as far as Trevor Francis, when he moved to Nottingham Forest, broke the transfer record and became the first £1 million player. But I think we're actually recording this as Neymar is about to finalise his transfer to Paris Saint-Germain, and I don't think anybody of right mind could say that is if you add in all the kind of the tax implications and the bonuses and the wages, how that kind of transfer can be sustainable. So I think Daniel Levy has a point. I think we're at a strange time where we assume that because of the things which have been reported about Sky Sports and their overspend for the last broadcasting contract, there's this kind of weird assumption that we've now hit the peak of the Premier League's sort of global worth, and that as and when the broadcasting deal is renegotiated, there'll be at least a leveling out. Whereas previously we've seen big spikes every couple of years on its value. The one thing I'd say is that I don't know how anyone can predict that accurately, because it's an unknown situation. There is no real precedent. So yes, Daniel Levy has a broad point in the sense that no, you shouldn't be spending more than you can bring in. But football has this habit of recalibrating and creating new revenue streams from absolutely nowhere. And I also think that sort of we've started to see things like the sponsorship market opened up a little bit in terms of so previously you were allowed a single sponsor on a Premier League football shirt. Now obviously we've allowed a new market where you're allowed to place a new sponsor, new brand on a sleeve. I think in time, if there is a leveling out in the broadcasting contract, then I expect that will go further, so that you'll see sort of if you look at sort of French football shirts or some of the shirts in the Eredivisie, that there is a lot more sponsorship on there, and I think
perhaps we'll get to the point where for those of you who don't live in London, what we see nowadays is buses that, whilst they previously had sort of banner space for advertising on them, are now painted solely in the colours of the brand and
there you go.
Are no longer red.
I think that's what we'll move towards. I think it's objectionable, of course, but I think it's natural. The Premier League, if you present a Premier League an argument to the Premier League about making money, they will always sort of fall on the side of, well, yes, that would be a nice idea. And so I think give it 10 years, and I imagine there'll be brands stenciled on the actual fields themselves.
Maybe. I mean, you say there's no precedent for being able to predict this process of building coming towards an end, and perhaps there isn't within football. I mean, I would argue that in individual cases there definitely is. If you look at what's happened to some football clubs, there's no real precedent for it necessarily at the very top level, and that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about players like Neymar. But outside of football, there is definitely precedent for a boom and bust cycle within the financial market in itself. I mean, it's to my mind, it's essentially unquestionable that at some point it cannot continue to grow, because even from a very basic conceptual level, Seb, you have to agree that growth could not exist if recession didn't. One concept relies on the other to even exist as a word in the first place.
Yeah, no, well, it's an inarguable point. Of course it is, but in this instance, my hesitation is, it relates to kind of the level of popularity of football. I think, and also history, because as I said before, I mean, we've reached at least one point every decade for as long as I've been alive where people have said exactly the same thing. This is the moment where football sustainability becomes questionable, and this is when the market rebalances itself and the game reverts to some kind of vague normality. I don't know. I just all I'm really saying here is that I would be hesitant in anointing this as the point which matters in the game's history, just because I've thought the same so many times, and every 5 years we're at a different level, we're at a different peak, we're at a sort of we've reached a new level of disgustingness, and I'm just wary. Levy, so yeah, what he says is sensible. I think in relation to Tottenham, I think I hope I'm wrong. I think Tottenham have made a grave mistake this summer, because what they've said doesn't quite tally with what they've reportedly tried to do. So their basic problem is that they have a very strong first 11, but a very strict wage structure. So the top earners at White Hart Lane, or Wembley even, are Hugo Lloris and Harry Kane, both earning either very close to or literally £100,000 a week. But nobody will earn more than that until the new stadium is built. The problem Tottenham have is not necessarily spending the money on securing the transfer itself, but on paying a player who's good enough to fit into that first team less than £100,000, which is a very understandable issue. I think what most Tottenham fans would say is not, we need a new centre forward or a new centre back or a new midfielder. It's more, there isn't an awful lot below that surface level. So
sufficient squad strength.
I don't think so. And the club's response to that would be that, well, we have faith in our academy, and I think that's all well and good. But a youth player is almost a hologram in a sense until he becomes a professional, because every supporter in the country will relate to this, and that every team has these 16, 17-year-old players who people whisper about and project greatness onto and assume are going to become first-team regulars within seconds of stepping onto the pitch. It just doesn't work like that. A Harry Kane is a generational talent, if that. I think in the last 20 years, really Tottenham have produced two academy players of note. Ledley King, of course, Harry Kane. Harry Winks, a young midfielder at Tottenham, may well become a third, because he's an extremely good player who will almost certainly play for England, I think. But I think it's a grave mistake to assume progression.
And is it maybe a danger of having Mauricio Pochettino as your manager, in that perhaps you might, having seen his track record with young players and knowing about his talents there, the club might put too much faith in him to bring forth members of the academy to replace first team members when they're not quite ready? Well,
I don't know. It's very hard to say. I think that there's certainly, the conditions certainly exist for a kind of an essentially a leap of faith, which doesn't really belong in modern football. I think Pochettino is owed the right to dictate terms about what he wants his first team environment to be. What I would question is whether the reality that the club has presented. I think Daniel Levy, within the statement that you quoted earlier, he also said that there hasn't been a player that that we've identified as being worthwhile that we couldn't afford. Depending on who you listen to, that's not strictly true. I think although they haven't necessarily been reported, there are several very connected journalists who claim that actually Tottenham have tried 3 or 4 times to sign a player this summer, but with no joy. So I don't think the problem is necessarily the club's financial situation, because I think a lot of fans accept it. I mean, they understand. I mean, the new stadium is literally being built, so there is tangible evidence for why the situation is as it is. But I think there's a sort of a cycle of disinformation that the club have got themselves into, and I think a lot of this frustration could be alleviated with a little bit more clarity in my mind, because we are recording this on the 2nd of August. The season is 10 days away, and Tottenham look extremely thin. I mean, you know, they unquestionably they have a team that can contend, a first team that can contend for the Premier League title. But at the time of not writing, speaking, Moussa Dembele is not going to be fit for the first game of the season, nor is Victor Wanyama, nor is Danny Rose, nor is Eric Lamela. I mean,
you could also argue, I suppose, from the style of football that Tottenham,
very attritional physically,
exactly, and so that it's unlikely that, like for example, Leicester City. I mean, one of the other things I was going to say when you were talking earlier was that it's interesting to think about how and why a team does well. And I think one of the things that Leicester City showed, and while this is a bit of an anomaly, what they did show was that I think togetherness and the right mental vibe going into a season is very important.
Yes.
And Claudio Ranieri obviously was able to do an incredible job of sustaining that positivity, and that made a massive difference on the pitch. And these are sort of unidentifiable outliers, really, things that you can't really account for. But if you look around the league, and we try to account for it, Tottenham is one of the teams that I would look at and go, very strong sense of team cohesion there. The manager is very popular at the club. The players all seem to like each other. The lack of addition may hurt the club, in the sense of lack of squad strength. And as you said, there's a certain level of physical attrition given the style of play. So it's unlikely that you'll go through the season like Leicester City did, lucky with injuries.
Well, Joe, also factor in the Champions League. I mean, Leicester City. Leicester City competed on one front when they won I'm not trying to diminish their achievement, but not at all. But they're again. I mean, Liverpool under Brendan Rodgers were a very good example. Chelsea under Antonio Conte, it is just easier because you have fewer games and the athletic demands are less. I think the point you make about Pochettino is absolutely right. I think Kyle Walker, for instance. I know a lot of supporters got angry about the sort of the whispers that began in sort of March and April, but it was very apparent that Walker's attention drifted, and the moment that happened, even to the detriment of his own side, because Walker is a superior player to Kieran Trippier, he was gone. He was left out of all the important games. He was left out of the North London derby, the FA Cup semi-final, primarily because he had strayed from the pack. And there are a lot of fans that got very angry about that, and not about Pochettino, but towards sort of any journalist reporting. I think if you look back at, I think it was Jack Pitbrook who broke that story. I think maybe March or something, and the abuse he got was just dreadful. But it was an example of Pochettino saying, "Okay, well then, if you're not with us, then you're on the outside now." And he was. I mean, I know people have said that sort of Walker's departure is an indication that Tottenham are now a selling club again. Not true. Pochettino wanted himself.
No. I have to agree, and I think as well, that it's clear that there is some active intention from Pochettino to, as best he can, and whilst it's an impossible job to be able to control all of these individual elements totally, as best he can, he wants to curate the I don't know the right word to use it. I don't want to say vibe again, but I guess I'm going to have to curate the right atmosphere. Yeah.
Well, I suppose protect the meritocracy, or ironclad the unity. However you want to dress it up, I think it's very true. The thing is, Joe, is that it's not a mutually exclusive situation. You can do that, and you can protect the environment and guard all your intangibles. But you do have to play along with the modern game a little bit, in the sense that you have to respect what works and what doesn't. And
absolutely. For example, you've said this yourself before. We mentioned recently Ross Barkley, who'd been, in the newspapers kind of reported as maybe of interest to Tottenham. But one of the issues that you brought up around that was that he wanted more money than Tottenham are going to pay any player, and introducing that element into a dressing room is the opposite of maintaining that, carefully curated atmosphere.
For a lot of reasons. I mean, I think if we were talking about a better player, it's still an issue, but it's less of a one. But I think if you were to say, I mean, we're picking an arbitrary figure here. If you were to pay Ross Barkley £120,000 a week, the message it sends to a Harry Kane, a Hugo Lloris, a Toby Alderweireld, a Jan Vertonghen is so destructive, potentially, because two things then happen. The first, obviously, is that every player under that wage is knocking on Daniel Levy's door asking for a renegotiation. Secondly, it's a bit more tenuous, but secondly, you create a threat to the morale, because Ross Barkley, respectfully, has never really done anything in football. He is a theory. He's quite a good player. He's done some nice things at Everton. He scored a few memorable goals. But in terms of actually proving that he's worth anything like that number, no, he's nothing. So the threat to the harmony is enormous.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah, as you say, the effect on other players, the effect on team morale and team cohesion as well. Because I think everyone is an individual these days. I think everyone looks at the world, through their own eyes, and whether you want to or not, as if you're the centre of that world. Footballers are in a almost sympathetic and perilous position in that they are paid an awful lot of money. They're told repeatedly that they're very, very special and very, very important. And it would be very difficult, I imagine, for, your Harry Kanes to accept that someone like Ross Barkley, who is ostensibly inferior to you as a football player, comes into your club and gets paid more money than you. You're not really going to like that person very much.
And I would entirely side with Harry Kane on that, or any other player, or Dele Alli, because it's fair. Like, I mean, we sort of, as civilians, we look at football and, we say, well, why isn't £80,000 enough? And that's fine. But if you add the context of what these guys, if you pretend that Tottenham is just a normal office, and you divide their salaries by 10, then all of a sudden you can relate to it and thinking, yeah, hang on, why is that guy earning more than me? We can all relate to that. And that affects your morale. And so, yes, you have to defer to what football is sometimes. And
I would suggest also that you probably have to divide their salaries by more than 10.
Yeah. I think actually my GCSE maths is not a high point in my life, so forgive me. But
I'd say 50.
Yeah, probably
that's
something
being
like
generous.
That is being generous. You're quite right. But I think the other thing with the Ross Barkley, interestingly, is that one of the theories behind his kind of, because the obvious question about him is that what would be so wrong with you staying at Everton? I mean, it's never hurt your international chances. Everton are progressive and you're spending money. And one of the sort of theories is that he doesn't like the way he's managed by Ronald Koeman, and he doesn't like the sort of he was supposedly highly indulged by Roberto Martinez, and Koeman is much more of a disciplinarian. He's a much more authoritative figure.
And he favours a team.
He favours a team, but then you think, well, I know there are some key differences, but ideologically, him and Pochettino are not that far apart as people, as managers. And you think,
well, you look at, as you said, you already described how Pochettino dealt with the Kyle Walker situation
without sort of any kind of emotional hesitation. It was like, okay, right, you're done. And then, you saw how quickly the transfer was actually completed. Daniel Levy wanted his asking price, and that delayed it. But I think that Pochettino was certainly absolutely fine to. You saw the difference between Manchester City's pursuit of Kyle Walker and Manchester United's pursuit of Eric Dyer. Dyer wasn't for sale and wasn't sold, whereas Kyle Walker very much was for sale. But Levy wanted as much as possible out of Man City and got it. Fair play to him for that. I hear a lot of people saying, well, Barkley, if you're able to get Barkley in under the sort of the wage structure, Pochettino would do his magic. Well, you hear that, but it's actually quite a generic phrase. Where is the detailed reasoning for that happening? I mean, I don't really understand it. A player that sort of wants to be given free rein at Everton and sort of because he hasn't been, he's determined to walk away from what is a very lucrative contract offer by all accounts. I think he would actually probably, if he were to sign for Tottenham, he'd have to take a wage cut.
No, it's interesting, and Ross Barkley more generally as well is an example of a luxury player whose time is potentially coming, to a close in the current era of football. I mean, I've talked to Alex Stewart about this before from a tactical point of view. I'd be keen to get your opinion on it as well, Seb, because Ross Barkley, and I know that there are plenty or too many reasons why he's compared to Wayne Rooney, and that they're not, so similar in terms of play style. But he plays that number 10 role. He enjoys the idea of the free role. He wants to be the creative without necessarily, and I don't want to do him a disservice, but without necessarily all of the defensive effort or being defensively minded. But as football tactically moves forwards, I think what we're seeing growing popularity is, I suppose, there's plenty of different things, but two examples. Firstly, one of them is Pochettino's Tottenham, who are all very well drilled, who all have specific jobs to do, who all work as a team, and they're much more of a unit than a group of individuals. And Pep Guardiola's team, who, stylistically play quite differently to Tottenham, but very, very similar. They all have specific jobs to do, and whilst it might appear that there's lots of free reign on the field, that's not really accurate when you understand the kind of training that they undergo, and the kind of the intensity of Guardiola's positional play requires a ridiculous amount of focus and concentration. In some ways, you could argue that from an individual point of view, it's much more rigid to achieve what they do that looks free-flowing overall. So Ross Barkley and other players like Mesut Ozil, who's obviously a fantastic football player, they're finding themselves nowadays in a situation where they are luxury players in a league that can't quite afford them. I mean, if you, as you said, Ross Barkley wants to earn over £100,000. So Tottenham, who finished second in the league last season, you can't afford to not necessarily from a financial point of view, but they can't afford from a footballing point of view to carry a player like that. Arsenal have the same issue with Mesut Ozil. It's unfortunate for them because Mesut Ozil is obviously one of their, best three players, you could argue. But they repeatedly find that to feature him in the team, they have to move a couple of other objects which might not be beneficial to them.
Essentially,
exactly.
Somewhere else.
And we're moving into a period in football, tactically speaking, where it seems like that concession isn't worth the payoff anymore. And so these players, Ross Barkley, you think, where else is he going to go? I was just thinking about that when you were saying he could stay at Everton. He wants to get paid that much money, so there's only a certain number of clubs who can afford to pay him that, none of whom really are looking to move into a position where they want to buy a luxury player like that, or that they couldn't get a better one.
This is the thing, because I think there's still even though football has evolved, I think you could say, if to use your Arsenal example, I think you could say that a player like Alexis Sanchez, for instance, is given a relatively free role. I mean, not in the traditional sense of the description, but he is encouraged to drift. He is encouraged to kind of ad-lib his way through games a little bit from the left side. I think if you want to be that if you want that role, you have to be a far better player than Ross Barkley is or promises to be. There is a chasm between what Alexis Sanchez is and the sort of the extremity of Ross Barkley's potential. There's no comparison made at all. I think what's interesting is that one of the theories doing the rounds in the sort of Tottenham social media community is that, and actually, this has been reported by I think Matt Hughes at the Times, that Pochettino sees Barkley eventually as a kind of long-term successor to Moussa Dembele, which I find extremely difficult to understand, because Dembele, in a sense, is really a kind of a footballing unicorn. He is a very, very strange footballer to watch, because he's this odd blend of ridiculous upper body strength and close control, and he's entirely unique within the context of the Premier League. There is no player elsewhere that I'd really compare with him. One of his features, though, is that he never really puts the ball at risk. He sometimes gets dispossessed and he takes one chance too many, but generally with his passing, he'll rarely make a pass which is more than sort of 10 or 15 yards. He'll never really he's not the kind of player, for instance, who will ping a Hollywood ball 40 yards from one wing to another. He's not even someone from the middle of the pitch. He plays, through balls over the top of a defence. He will occasionally cut through a line of possession, but he's there to carry the ball. Ross Barkley, the one thing that is the negative that has existed around him since he first stepped on a football pitch in England is he puts the ball in harm's way all the time. He's technically very gifted. He's strong, so when he receives the ball, he can kind of pirouette away from a player, hold a player off. But if you talk to an Everton fan about Ross Barkley, people who watch him, for every minute of every game, he's a maddening footballer because he runs down cul-de-sacs. He seems almost to have too much faith in his own ability. I don't think he's a bad player, but the idea of trying to convert him into the kind of player that Moussa Dembele is I think Mauricio Pochettino is one of the very best coaches in the world. I think that's a real stretch. I think I think it's the kind of risk that you could understand if we were talking about a player who was maybe worth 10 to 15 million pounds and who was 20. Ross Barkley's 24. The fee is reportedly around 40 to 50 million pounds. It's that to sort of acknowledge that you're basically that to make a transfer work of that size, you would have to break a player down to his basic ingredients and rebuild him. It's extraordinary. And also the suggestion that there is no other player in world football who you could do this with other than Ross Barkley. I just don't go along with that. And I
Alan Smith converted from centre forward to a holding midfielder.
Not brilliantly. I mean, he sort of he did okay. He just looked like a player.
Come now, Seb. Come now. He did do it though.
He did better than I thought he would do at it. He always looked like a player who was that was playing via textbook. He was having to think about what he should be doing rather than I don't think he ever had a feel for the role. He just, he was a combative player and he was passable. I wouldn't say he was good, but Barkley, I don't understand it. And I also, it goes back to sort of, there are, if you're willing to sort of, to think of, if you're thinking along the lines of rebuilding footballers and repurposing them, then that the line always around Tottenham is that there's such a tiny pool of players that they can choose from. Yeah, it's kind of true, but you could very easily look at a player, someone like Will Hughes, who moved for £8 million to Watford. Not a player that is currently good enough to play for Tottenham, but with the sort of the abilities that he has, the ability to carry the ball, to pass the ball, he's actually a relatively good defender. You would think that actually that is a closer sort of. Sorry, my phone's going off. That is a more logical approach to trying to build Dembele 2.0. And yeah, it's just what we said at the beginning, that Tottenham's activity is very ill-defined and very vague, and what their intentions are, the whole thing is incredibly nebulous. And yet, here we are, first week of August, and still it's the same. There's no clarity. And all the while, the fans have had to watch almost each one of their rivals spend in excess of £100 million. It's very strange. And
it is strange. You know what else is strange, Seb?
Yeah.
That you exist in 2017 and that your phone isn't on vibrate.
The thing is that my phone is on vibrate, but it is paired with my iPad. So when I said my phone is going off, my phone was silently lighting up, but
your iPad was making noise.
The thing is, it's currently out of reach. So if I was to silence it, I would have to leave my microphone.
I was confused because I'm the sort of person who sits on a train, and then when someone's phone rings, I'm just very confused as to where they exist. Where do you exist? No one's phone rings anymore.
Yeah,
it just
I agree.
Vibrates. It vibrates. It makes a feeling. It makes a feeling in your leg. Have you ever had phantom phone ringing? Phantom leg vibration?
Which of us hasn't?
It's a horrible affliction, isn't it?
And it's kind of. I think there's a psychological aspect to that. It's kind of are you feeling it, or are you wanting your phone to ring because no one calls you?
Well, that's probably why it happens to me all of the time.
You're thinking, my phone's ringing. No, it hasn't rung since 2011.
Yeah. What we should do now if you don't mind giving me another couple of minutes of your time, Seb,
it would be a pleasure.
I would like to address some questions from the viewers of the uMAXit YouTube channel.
Okay.
Probably questions to videos that you have no right or need to answer. But I'm going to ask you anyway because you're here.
Okay.
uMAXit, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, but they commented on the last podcast asking us, what do you guys think of the PSG bid and its effect on the inflation of football players' prices? That's interesting. We touched on that slightly before. I haven't really followed this story though. I mean, what is the actual reported bid, Seb?
So the latest this morning, and obviously this is subject to change, is that he will move for somewhere in the region of £220 million.
Right, that's just the transfer bid. That doesn't include any of
that. Doesn't include anything else. That is just the basic bid.
So when you add it all up with the tax and everything,
I think it comes to around £500 million.
And what are his wages likely to be?
I have no idea.
But we can assume they're very high.
Not under £100,000 a week.
No, he's not moving to Spurs. So.
He's not.
Let's just say, for
let
example,
that go. Yeah.
that they were $500,000.
Yeah.
Is that absurd? Maybe it's not anymore. I don't know. We live in a surreal world.
It is, but I think the way to answer Mnesh's question is that I think it's such a stupid transfer. I mean, not stupid in the general sense, the ridiculous nonsense this is about, because I think the consensus is this is a transfer which is about more than football. It's about legitimacy, it's about ego, and it's about brand. I think as a result, the sort of the happy implication is that I don't think it affects it, because I think we've reached a level of ridiculousness which is kind of, it is what it is already. It didn't need Paris Saint-Germain to spend what they're about to spend to make it absurd. And so I think in a way it really is an outlier. I mean, obviously it is anyway because it's a new transfer record, but in the broader sense, it's so absurd that it's of no real consequence. I mean, it has an impact in the sense that it loads Barcelona with an awful lot of cash, and they will almost certainly spend it, but some of it before the window shuts. But I don't think as a result that will become a standard price for footballers of a certain ability. Because I think also one of the sort of the issues here is that he is not a player. You know, there are maybe at any given time about 5 players in world football who just don't have a fee. Like probably Leo Messi is one of them. I previously assumed Neymar was another. They're not for sale at any price, so they don't really have a value in the market. But so I think it's an unusual transfer in the sense that I think there was a very special set of circumstances which have allowed it to happen. I think some of those are explainable by Neymar's father. He loves that money. So yeah.
Rewo asks, guys, are you planning to make a similar series about European championships and or from other continents sometime in the future? He was commenting on one of our World Cup videos. Rewo, we may well do that. We have no plans to do it at the moment, but we really enjoyed making the World Cup series, so that is potentially something that we will look to do in the future. And Joe MC has said a couple of times, I think it's a couple of times, but it might be someone else, has asked why the podcast is not available on the UK iTunes. I think it is. I mean, to give you a little insight into the frustrations, daily working frustrations of myself, my computer for some reason has decided to reject allowing me to use iTunes. It just doesn't work. So, Seb, you might be quite useful here, actually. Have you got iTunes?
I do, yeah.
Do you want to... Let's do this live, like we're announcing someone being kicked out of the Big Brother house or something. Can you go onto the iTunes store, have a look on the podcast section, and Google Whiteboard Football? Don't Google it. That doesn't make any sense. So use the search function to look for Whiteboard Football Extra. That's the name of the podcast.
All right, okay.
Because to my understanding, it does exist on there.
No, it's definitely there.
Yeah, and you are currently in the UK.
I'm currently in the UK. I'm currently in the iTunes store, and it is down under Whiteboard Football Extra. But if in doubt, just search uMAXit Football, and they will all come up.
Yeah, try that. Okay, Joe MC. I hope that's helped. If not, you can be more specific in your YouTube comment. Let us know why it's not working, or if you really want, you can send an email to support@uMAXit.com. Because that doesn't go to me and someone else will deal with it. Delightful.
Oh, yeah,
Delightful.
So it's absolutely somebody else's problem. Yeah.
Well, I try and ensure that it will be. Okay, Seb, thanks very much for your time. It's a delight to talk to you.
You too, Joe.
And we'll speak to you again soon.